I had always been a quiet farmer, content with working my land, tending to my livestock, and minding my own business. So when I woke up one early morning and saw a long, freshly paved road cutting right through my eastern pasture, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I walked toward the unexpected sight, the reality hit me like a hammer. I had never approved this. I had never even been consulted. And yet here it was, a two-lane asphalt road running straight across my farm as if it had always belonged there. And to make matters worse, there were construction cones still scattered along the sides, indicating that this had been done recently, likely within the last few nights while I was sleeping, which meant that whoever was responsible had deliberately gone behind my back, knowing full well that what they were doing was illegal. And as I stood there in disbelief, I could already see a few cars passing through, treating my property as if it were nothing more than a public road, and I could feel my blood beginning to boil because this was not just an inconvenience. It was trespassing, theft, and an absolute violation of my property rights. So I stormed back into my house, grabbed my phone, and immediately started calling local authorities, determined to get to the bottom of this before it escalated any further. But the more people I spoke to, the more I realized that this was not just an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move by the homeowners association from the nearby subdivision, the same HOA that I had refused to join years ago when they tried to buy out my land, and now it seemed that they had taken matters into their own hands, deciding that they didn't need my permission to do as they please. But what I didn't understand was how they had managed to get construction crews out here without anyone notifying me. So I started digging deeper, calling local offices, checking property records, and even speaking to some neighbors. And what I found made my stomach turn. According to some of the documents I obtained, the HOA had somehow filed paperwork claiming that my land had been acquired for community access, citing some obscure zoning clause that didn't even apply to my property. And as I read through the legal jargon, it became obvious that this was nothing more than an attempt to steal my land under the guise of public necessity. But they had made a huge mistake because they had failed to get any official approval. And as soon as I gathered enough proof, I knew exactly what I had to do. I was going to shut this down immediately, and they were going to regret ever thinking they could pull something like this over on me. So the next morning, I went straight to the HOA's office, demanding to speak with whoever was responsible for this nonsense. But as soon as I walked in, I was met with smug expressions and dismissive attitudes from the board members, particularly the president, a man named Greg Whitmore, who had always been a thorn in my side ever since the HOA was formed. And when I slammed my documents down on the table, showing them the proof of their illegal actions, he simply leaned back in his chair and smirked before telling me that the road was already built, the community needed it, and that I should just let it go. As if I were being unreasonable for wanting to protect my own land. But I wasn't about to be intimidated by a bunch of self-important bureaucrats who thought they could strong-arm me into submission, so I made it clear that if they didn't remove the road immediately, I would be taking legal action. But instead of backing down, they doubled down, claiming that I had no authority to block what was now a necessary roadway for the community. And that was when I realized just how far they were willing to go to push me out of my own property. So I left that meeting more furious than ever, already planning my next move, because if they thought they could intimidate me into rolling over, they had another thing coming. And that night, as I sat on my porch, watching car after car drive down the road that should never have existed, I made a decision. I was going to fight this, no matter what it took, and I wasn't going to let some HOA bullies walk all over me, because this wasn't just about a road anymore. It was about my rights, my land, and my future, and I wasn't about to let them take any of it from me. I woke up before sunrise, my mind already set on what needed to be done because I had spent the entire night going over my options, weighing every possible outcome. But at the end of the day, it all boiled down to one simple truth. This was my land, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. So I grabbed my tools, hopped into my truck, and drove straight to the spot where that illegal road cut through my pasture, determined to put an end to this nonsense before it went any further. And as I stepped out of my truck, I could already hear the distant sound of early morning traffic approaching. People from the HOA community driving over my land as if it were theirs, completely oblivious of the fact that they were trespassing. And that was the final straw for me. So without wasting any time, I pulled out heavy-duty metal barriers, the kind used for livestock fencing, and began setting them up across the width of the road, making sure they were anchored deep into the ground and just. As I finished securing the last one, a car came to a screeching halt right in front of me, the driver honking aggressively as if I were the one in the wrong. But I ignored them and continued my work, planting several large signs around the barricade that read, "Private property," and "Trespassing, road closed," making it crystal clear that this road was no longer accessible. And within minutes, more cars started piling up, angry residents getting out and demanding to know what I was doing, as if I owed them an explanation. But I simply told them the truth. This land was mine, and they had no right to be using it. And that's when the shouting started. People yelling about how they needed this road, how I was being selfish for blocking it, and how I had no right to interfere with something that benefited the community. But I wasn't about to let a bunch of entitled homeowners tell me what I could and couldn't do on my own land, so I stood my ground, arms crossed as they huffed and puffed, making threats about calling the HOA, calling the police, and even suing me. But none of it scared me because I knew my rights, and I had every legal reason to shut this down. And sure enough, within the hour, the HOA president, Greg Whitmore, showed up, looking red-faced and furious, marching toward me like he thought he was some kind of authority figure. But I didn't so much as flinch as he launched into a tirade about how I was violating community regulations, how I was causing unnecessary disruption, and how I was going to pay for this. But I cut him off before he could go any further, pulling out my stack of legal documents, slapping them against his chest, and telling him in no uncertain terms that this road was illegal, that I had already contacted my lawyer, and that if he or anyone else tried to mess with my land again, I would take them to court and make sure they regretted it. But instead of backing down, he smirked, a smug, infuriating expression that told me he had something up his sleeve, and that's when he dropped the bombshell. The HOA had already filed a complaint against me, accusing me of obstructing a public road, and not only that, but they were also fining me for violating community access laws, despite the fact that I wasn't even part of their HOA, and for a moment I just stood there stunned because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These people had stolen my land, built an illegal road on it, and now they were trying to sue me for shutting it down. But I wasn't about to let them win. So I told Greg to take his lawsuit and shove it, then turned on my heel and walked away, ignoring his threats as I climbed back into my truck. But the fight was far from over because within days, I started receiving letters from the HOA's attorneys, each one more aggressive than the last, demanding that I cease and desist my interference with community infrastructure, threatening massive fines, property liens, and even legal action if I didn't comply. But instead of backing down, I doubled down, hiring my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Lisa Carter, who took one look at my case and immediately saw through the HOA's lies, telling me that this was nothing more than a bullying tactic, an attempt to strong-arm me into submission, and that we had more than enough evidence to fight back. So with her guidance, I filed my own lawsuit against the HOA, accusing them of trespassing, illegal construction, and property violations. And as soon as the case became official, things took a turn for the worse. Suddenly, I started getting anonymous threats in my mailbox, warning me to drop it before things got ugly. My farm was vandalized, fences cut, animals let loose, and even my truck was keyed, and while I couldn't prove it was the HOA, I had no doubt in my mind that they were behind it, trying to intimidate me into giving up. But they underestimated me because, if anything, their harassment only made me more determined to see this through to the end. And as the court date approached, more and more people started taking sides, some local residents standing with me, disgusted by the HOA's corruption, while others, particularly those living in the HOA's neighborhood, rallied against me, convinced that I was the villain. But I didn't care what they thought because I wasn't doing this for anyone but myself, fighting for what was rightfully mine. And when the day finally came for the first hearing, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high, ready to take them all down. The courtroom was packed, a mix of local farmers, HOA residents, and even a few reporters who had caught wind of the outrageous lawsuit. And as I sat at my table, my lawyer Lisa Carter by my side, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me because this wasn't just about a road anymore. This was about standing up to corruption, about proving that private property rights still mattered, and about making sure these HOA bullies didn't get away with what they had done. And as the judge entered and the proceedings began, the HOA's attorney, a slick, corporate-looking man named Richard Holloway, stood up and launched into a carefully rehearsed argument, painting me as an obstructionist, a stubborn landowner who was causing unnecessary hardship to the community, arguing that my actions had disrupted essential traffic flow and that my refusal to allow the road to remain was unreasonable given that it was already built. But as I listened to his nonsense, barely able to keep from scoffing out loud, Lisa calmly stood up, walked to the center of the courtroom, and began dismantling their argument piece by piece. First by presenting undeniable proof that the HOA had never obtained the legal right to build on my land. Then by showing documented evidence that they had falsified paperwork, going so far as to manipulate zoning records in an attempt to make it seem as if they had a claim. And as she laid out every illegal move they had made, exposing how they had not only trespassed, but had also knowingly violated multiple land use laws, I could see the confidence in Greg Whitmore's face slowly fading, his smug arrogance replaced with a nervous twitch in his jaw as he realized just how deep in trouble they were. And when Lisa called a professional land surveyor to the stand, one who confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that my property line had been blatantly ignored in the construction of the road, I knew we had them cornered. But the real turning point came when we brought in a former HOA board member, a man named Daniel Foster, who had recently resigned after learning about the illegal road and refused to be part of the cover-up, and as he took the stand, his testimony was damning. He detailed how Greg and several other board members had knowingly pushed the road project forward without legal approval, how they had bribed a local official to delay the notification process so that I wouldn't find out until it was too late, and how they had actively manipulated HOA funds to cover construction costs. And as he spoke, the entire courtroom fell into stunned silence, the weight of the corruption laid bare for everyone to see. And at that moment, I knew we had won. But the HOA wasn't done yet, and in a desperate move, Richard Holloway tried to claim that because the road was now in use and had become an essential thoroughfare, I should be forced to grant an easement in the interest of public good. But Lisa was ready for this, and with a sharp, unwavering tone, she reminded the court that property rights were not dictated by convenience, that no amount of usage justified illegal land seizure, and that if we allowed this to stand, it would set a dangerous precedent for anyone who owned land near a powerful HOA. And the judge, an older man who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, finally leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he looked directly at Greg Whitmore and the other board members, then turned to me, his expression unreadable as he delivered his ruling. My land rights were absolute. The HOA had no claim to my property. The road was to be removed immediately, and the HOA was ordered to pay damages for trespassing, destruction of property, and legal fees. And as soon as those words left his mouth, the courtroom erupted, half the crowd cheering while the other half muttered angrily, Greg turning pale as he realized the full weight of what had just happened. But I wasn't done yet, because the next step was holding them accountable for their crimes. And as my lawyer prepared to file additional lawsuits against the individuals responsible for fraud and harassment, local authorities got involved, launching their own investigation into the bribery and financial mismanagement within the HOA, and within weeks, Greg and several other board members were removed from their positions, some even facing criminal charges, while I finally got to see the road ripped up and my land restored to the way. It was before this whole nightmare began, and as I stood there watching the construction crews remove the last remnants of asphalt, I felt a sense of satisfaction like never before, knowing that I had not only defended my own rights, but had also sent a message to every other corrupt HOA out there. Try to steal from the wrong person and you'll pay the price.